Hello, and thanks for stopping by. The sheer number of streets, roads, courtyards, squares and alleyways which come together to make up London is truly mind-boggling. To give you some idea, the London A to Z currently lists around 70,000 of them. Amongst all of these, you'll find plenty bearing unusual names. Frying Pan Alley, Crutched Friars, and Savage Gardens are just a few which spring to mind. But there's one in particular which I've always found to be especially gruesome. Bleeding Heart Yard. Laid out as a T-shaped cul-de-sac close to Farringdon Station in Clerkenwell, Bleeding Heart Yard has a suitably old-fashioned feel to it, its atmosphere enhanced further by these cobblestones. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine blood trickling through here, if you happen to be so minded. The square that would later become known as Bleeding Heart Yard was first laid out in the 1680s as part of the Bishop of Ely's estate, a patch of land owned by, as the name indicates, the Bishops of Ely in Cambridgeshire, who used the site as their place of residence whenever they happened to be in London on business. You can still see their old medieval chapel, a survivor of the Great Fire of London no less, on Ely Place. And for many years, it was possible to walk directly between here and Bleeding Heart Yard, although that cut through has long since been gated. So, how did Bleeding Heart Yard come to gain such a gruesome name? Well, it would appear that the title originates from an old pub, a tavern that is believed to have been established in the area before Henry VIII's reformation of the church, so we're talking pre-1530s. The pub in question was called the Bleeding Heart of Our Lady, and it advertised itself with a rather nasty sign depicting the image of a heart pierced with swords and dripping with blood. A tavern, or rather a French wine bar and bistro as it is nowadays, called the Bleeding Heart, is still in business here today, although for much of the 20th century, this place was known as the far more genteel sounding Windsor Cafe. Over the years, the presence of this pub has led locals to concoct various bloodthirsty theories and legends in an attempt to explain where Bleeding Heart Yard's name really came from. The most infamous of these yarns, which you can find in the form of a long poem written down by Reverend Richard Harris Barham in his 19th century collection of myths and ghost stories called The Ingoldsby Legends, relates to a lady Alice Hatton, who, it is said, entered into a deal with the devil when she asked old Nick to have Queen Elizabeth I grant favours for her husband, Sir Christopher Hatton. In real life, Sir Christopher Hatton did indeed receive a blessing from the Queen. She was generous enough to bequeath him the lease of the land occupied by Ely Place, essentially taking control away from the bishops. The adjoining Hatton Garden, which is now famous for being at the centre of London's jewellery quarter, is named after him. After they were granted land and property here, the Hattons decided to celebrate with a big housewarming party. Only there was one problem. Lady Hatton forgot to invite the devil who'd made it all possible. Consequently, Satan conjured up an almighty storm, and as the wind and rain lashed down, he gate-crashed the proceedings, snatching Lady Hatton away in the midst of the chaos. As the story then goes, her mutilated body was found hours later at this very spot, the limbs having been torn away, and her heart, still dripping with blood, dumped on the cobblestones. Unsurprisingly, this barbaric account has also given rise to the legend that Lady Hatton's ghost now haunts the area. Apparently you can hear her toiling away at a ghostly water pump in the dead of the night. As the poem puts it, and still it is said at that small hour so dread, when all sober people are cosy in bed, there may sometimes be seen on a moonshiny night, standing close by the new pump, a lady in white, who keeps pumping away with 'twould seem all her might, though never a drop comes her pains to requite, and hence many passengers now are debarred from proceeding at nightfall through Bleeding Heart Yard. Yeah, there's just one problem with all this spiel. The Sir Christopher Hatton referred to in the story was a lifelong bachelor. He was never married, meaning there was no Lady Hatton to speak of in this instance. It's possible that this is a convoluted version of a similar violent tale, one which involves another Lady Hatton, Lady Elizabeth Hatton in this case, who was born in 1578. In this rendition, the Spanish ambassador, possibly Senor Gondomar, going by the timeline, falls in love with Lady Hatton and dances with her at the party. However, for some reason, the ambassador quickly turned very ugly indeed and proceeded to murder Lady Hatton. It's said that, when her slain body was found in the yard, her heart was still beating away, pumping blood out onto the cobbles. Again though, this anecdote is utter hogwash. Lady Hatton died peacefully in her bed in 1646, and was buried close to Ely Place at St Andrew Holborn Church. She certainly wasn't murdered. Another disturbing claim related to the yard's name suggests that a wicked father imprisoned his daughter within her bedroom here, and that this poor young woman would sob away at the window, crying, bleeding heart, bleeding heart, bleeding away. The final explanation suggests that Bleeding Heart Yard originally referred to the fact that animals, especially deer, used to be slaughtered at this site before being carted off to the Bishop of Ely's kitchen. In my opinion, this has some validity, and could possibly have been a practice which inspired the tavern's first owners to name their inn the Bleeding Heart of Our Lady, which in turn inspired the ghastly roster of tales that we've just heard. I guess we'll never know for sure though, will we? Gruesome legends aside, Bleeding Heart Yard also holds an important place in English literature, for it serves as a prominent location in Charles Dickens's Little Dorrit, which was first published between 1855 and 1857. In the book, the inventor Daniel Doyce, the Plornish family, and an Italian fellow named John Baptiste Cavaletto all reside in Bleeding Heart Yard, the properties there being owned by the unscrupulous landlord Christopher Casby. Chapter 12 in Little Dorrit is entitled Bleeding Heart Yard, and in it, Dickens describes the location as being much changed in feature and fortune, yet with some relish of ancient greatness about it. 2 or 3 mighty stacks of chimneys and a few large dark rooms gave the yard character. He then tells us that the poor folk who reside there set up their rest among its faded glories, as Arabs of the desert pitched their tents amongst the fallen stones of the pyramids. Bleeding Heart Yard was indeed a desperately impoverished place during the 19th century. It happens to lie just around the corner from Saffron Hill, where Dickens placed Fagin's Den in Oliver Twist, and as the character John Baptiste Cavaletto illustrates, this area was also inhabited by a large community of working-class Italian migrants, many of who had been displaced during the Napoleonic Wars. So much so that for many decades, Clerkenwell was known as London's Little Italy. During this era, Bleeding Heart Yard, which lay close to a notably large dunghill, was widely considered to be one of the area's most dangerous locales, with outsiders being strongly advised against venturing there after nightfall. In the early 19th century, the yard, along with several other surrounding streets, was also known as being home to many youngsters who carved out a living through street performing, specifically by parading around trained animals and inviting onlookers to view other curiosities. In November 1831, one reporter looked into this industry, and to be frank, the article he wrote is heartbreaking. Whole houses are occupied by these wretched boys, he tells us, who sleep 8 and 9 in a bed. Each boy's monkey is chained near him every night on going to rest. It would appear the boys involved in this work were controlled by gangs of men, both English and Italian, who charge the lads for bed and board and provide them with a simple breakfast of gruel in the morning. They will then hire out various animals and trinkets to them for the day, of which the journalist provides a full price list. For a monkey in uniform, 3 shillings per day. For a box of white mice, 1 shilling and 6pence per day. For a tortoise, 1 shilling and 6pence per day. For a dog and monkey, the latter may be frequently seen in the streets riding on the dog's back, 3 shillings per day. For dancing dogs, 4 in number, including dresses, spinning wheel, pipe and tabor being a small drum, 5 shillings per day. Years later, in August 1866, little had changed in Bleeding Heart Yard, as another reporter, this time writing for the Christian World newspaper, discovered. The houses are black with decay and grime, he begins, and standing at the bottom of the court, you seem to be looking through a ravine of human misery on which the sweet light of heaven seldom shines. You have been seen, however. Perhaps that loud whistle was a signal. And instantly, the walls glisten with heads peeping out from the windows of the different stories. Despite this initially hostile reception, the writer says that as long as you're civil, the people of Bleeding Heart Yard are friendly and courteous, albeit very sickly looking. Many lived in cellars, and a poor widow with quick asthmatic breathing invites him in to look at her abode. Down a crazy staircase, catching glimpses of mould decay in every direction, I descended into the basement and entered a small room, he tells us. How small for the widow with her 4 children and an aged woman besides, who was cowering over the fire. I saw no signs of any bed, save something which might have held a couple of small children. The floor was the bed for the elders. She paid ½ a crown a week for this room, and counted it as a favour to get it at this price. The reporter then goes on to say that many of the houses crammed into Bleeding Heart Yard contain an average of 12 families each, 1 family per room. And there was even a rumour that one such group shared their cramped accommodation with a donkey. Not long after this account, the old Bleeding Heart Yard buildings were swept away in a slum clearance, although despite their dreadful condition, this action was fiercely opposed, for many of those living there had called the place home for years, and there was great uncertainty as to where they could go next. In the wake of this clearance, industry and workshops then moved in, and that more or less defines the character of Bleeding Heart Yard as it appears today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of Clerkenwell's Bleeding Heart Yard. Is it a place you're familiar with? If so, have you eaten at the Bleeding Heart Bistro? And which of the gruesome origin stories is your favourite? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.